another body system coming at you. We've got the respiratory system here in chapter 23. Now, before we dive into the A and P of this, let's think big picture. What are the functions of this respiratory system? Number one, we need a surface area for gas exchange. Surface area for gas exchange. Now these gases, right, oxygen, and don't forget, just as important, we're using this surface to exchange CO2 and get it out of the body. This, I would say, is the number one goal of the respiratory system, is to have gas exchange. Everything else is really supporting that. So in the respiratory system, right, the gas exchange is taking place in the lungs, but we also need some way to get air to those surfaces. So we need to move air to this respiratory surface. You can think of that as far as the trachea and all these other tubes, right, are passageways for the air. You could also consider the contraction of the diaphragm when we think about how we're moving that air, right? But it supports this gas exchange. Okay? We also want to protect that respiratory surface in the lung. And since we just left the lymphatic system, my guess is your first thought when I say protect is thinking about pathogens. And that's a great thought, right? We want to keep infections down in the lungs, but we're also trying to protect that surface from cold and from drying out. It's a very delicate surface. And so we'll look at how some of the anatomy here fits that function. Okay. Now, the last couple functions here I would say are a little peripheral, but obviously still important. We do use the respiratory system to create sounds for communication. So speech, right, the larynx is your voice box. That's part of the respiratory system. And then also you need to push air across the vocal cords in order for us to produce sounds. And so this is related, kind of a related role of the respiratory system. We also use the respiratory system to house the olfactory epithelium. And so this is going to play a role in our sense of smell or olfaction. Okay, so a lot of different things going on here. Now, the anatomy is primarily what you'll be focusing on in lab, but I did want to point a couple things out. So do note, right, they're splitting this into an upper and a lower respiratory system. The upper respiratory system includes things like the nose, the nasal cavity, and the pharynx, right? The pharynx is kind of like the back of the throat, so the back of the oral cavity up a little bit towards the nasal passage, right? That's the pharynx. The lower respiratory system begins at the larynx. Lower, larynx, all the way down to the lung, right? So the larynx, that's your voice box. You'd also include then the trachea, the bronchi, so bronchus is singular, but bronchi, primary, secondary, tertiary, right, as we split into smaller and smaller little tubes, and then the bronchioles, which are the smallest of the little tubes leading to alveoli in the lungs, right? That's all lower respiratory system. So what we're going to do is, again, those big structures, you'll be IDing them in lab, but we're going to look a little bit at what's called the respiratory mucosa. So a little bit of the kind of histology of what's going on across these different organs. So the respiratory mucosa right? Again, a mucous membrane, right, or mucosa here, is going to always be an epithelium and an underlying connective tissue. And as we look in the respiratory system, epithelium, that underlying connective tissue is always areolar connective tissue. We'll see in certain regions, maybe it's got more mucus glands, maybe it has more smooth muscle, but it's always going to be areolar connective tissue. You'll see this layer referred to as the lamina propria as you move throughout this system. Now, the epithelium is going to change from region to region here. So, for example, in the nasal cavity, right, what we want to do there is really kind of that filtering, moistening, warming the air, right? We usually call that conditioning. So the big role of this respiratory mucosa is to condition the air before it reaches the lung. And by condition, we mean make it warmer, wetter, and also filter it. Try to remove any pathogens along the way. Now you've experienced this on some of these cold mornings, right? You really want to warm that air up, make sure it's not super dry before it hits your lungs. It was below 0 this morning and you can feel that, right, as you're breathing. So in the nasal cavity, as we look at this respiratory mucosa, the epithelium here is going to be a pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Where's my picture here? Right, so there we go. Pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar, if you remember that way back, what was that, chapter 4. Now, think about its role in the nasal passage here. These layers have a lot of mucus present, right, for trapping pathogens. The cilia are going to help propel that mucus. And the mucus also is able to add moisture to the air as it passes by. I wanted to show you this. Okay, do you remember in A&P1 when you were learning the skull, the nasal concha, those kind of curved bones on the inside of the nasal passage? This next picture is maybe the weirdest picture in your textbook, right? They've taken this frontal plane of the head, and as you're looking in the nasal cavity, these are those nasal concha. They're these big curved, sometimes they're called turbinate bones. Picture this totally being covered by this pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium, right? Lots of moisture, lots of mucus there. This is actually one of the reasons you're supposed to breathe through your nose, right? Is to pass the air over this huge surface area that can trap and warm and moisten, i.e. condition the air before it gets to your lungs. Okay? Now, we will see this exact same tissue. Let's see, we need to go through the pharynx. I am going to run out of room. And then we'll go to the trachea. In the trachea, we will see this exact same tissue type, right? Our pseudo-stratified. Ciliated columnar epithelium. And actually in the trachea, the cilia becomes super important. So they produce what's called the mucus elevator, where mucus, right, all lining the trachea, as it traps bacteria, now the cilia are actually going to propel that mucus up and away from the lung. So they call that the mucus elevator, right? We're lifting it. And you'll notice that you do this, right? So if you clear your throat, because it's kind of feeling mucusy, you swallow the mucus. It's gross, right? When you put it that way, it's gross, but think about it. Where does that mucus and all the trapped bacteria go? right to your stomach where it can get destroyed by hydrochloric acid. So this mucus elevator is actually pretty ingenious, but gross. Okay, now in the pharynx, right, the back of the throat, think about it. So if you just go through and try to memorize all these different epithelia, it's one, boring. Yeah, it's just kind of lame, right? But think about it. So we have pseudostratified ciliated epithelium here and here. How about in the pharynx? The pharynx is a shared region, right? We share it with the respiratory tract as well as the digestive tract. So this region in the back of the throat, the back of your mouth, could be exposed to tortilla chips. And so that should tell us something about what we need from the epithelium. It needs to be tougher. It needs to be what? Stratified squamous. Right, so if you think through the function, you probably get there, right? Stratified squamous epithelium for protection. Okay, now if we drop below the trachea, the trachea starts to divide, right? So primary bronchi, secondary, tertiary, and then into, and so those bronchi, as the trachea starts to split, they're very similar to the trachea. So same as the trachea. We get even smaller then, and the bronchioles, these tiny tubes that are entering the alveoli. This is a simple cuboidal. Epithelium. Nothing too special about that. What you're going to see, though, is a real increase in smooth muscle in the lamina propria. So this is a cross-section of the trachea, right? We see the cartilage ring of the trachea, and here they're pointing out the respiratory epithelium. If you were in a bronchiole, right, out here in the connective tissue, you would see a lot more smooth muscle. So we see a big increase in the smooth muscle in that lamina propria. Right, in our areolar connective tissue layer. Now, the bronchioles then are very much like arterioles in the vascular system. This is going to be the region that determines how open or closed the airway is to certain regions of the lung, right? So we can do bronchodilation. We can open those airways up, or we can do bronchoconstriction and close them down. Now, what tends to drive students crazy is this is going to be the exact opposite as it was in the arterial system, right? Bronchodilation is a result of sympathetic nervous system inputs, right? Because the fight or flight response, we need to open the airway up and increase oxygenation. The other way maybe to think about this is someone who's in anaphylactic shock, right? If their airway is closing down, what are you going to give them? You're going to give them epi, right, which is a sympathetic nervous system response to open that airway, right? Epinephrine does vasoconstriction to increase blood pressure, increase blood flow, but bronchodilation to increase airflow, right? So that's where people are tricked up. Bronchoconstriction then, parasympathetic nervous system. And think about this, in that allergic response, histamine, which we saw causing vasodilation and leakiness, is constricting the airways, right? So they're opposites. Okay, so the bronchioles then play this super important part in determining airflow to different regions of the lung. Okay, on to the alveoli. And so let's do this. All right, when we get to the alveoli, our function here is the actual gas exchange. So we want very small distances for diffusion to take place. What kind of epithelium do we want? simple squamous, good. So in the lung, right, in the alveoli, these little air sacs, we have simple squamous epithelium, right, with underlying connective tissue. Again, alveoli are all these little pockets, and the beauty of having all these little tiny pockets in your lungs is this dramatically increases the surface area of your lung. I love your book. It gives you random examples like if you spread the lung out, it would cover, like the area of a tennis court or something like that. So these little pockets are super important there. Now, with this simple squamous epithelium, how I should say this. In the alveoli, we have a couple important cell types. The simple squamous epithelium that's serving as gas exchange, these cells, they're showing them here in purple, these are called pneumocyte type 1. Okay, very awkward, right? Type 1 pneumocyte, also fine, but they usually say pneumocyte type 1. That's just simple squamous epithelium, right? Gas exchange is taking place there. We also have in the lungs pneumocyte type 2, right? These are specialized cells, they've put them here in a yellow, right, that are kind of studded throughout the alveoli. These produce a chemical called surfactant. Now, surfactants are good at decreasing surface tension. So if you picture you're like washing this greasy pan and it has that sheen, that layer on top, if you drop soap, Dawn dish soap, into that pan, you'll see the oils kind of disperse, right? That is, dish soap contains surfactants to cut that surface tension. Why do we want that in the lung? These alveoli are so tiny that if you exhaled and those surfaces touched, surface tension would just pull them right together. They'd be very hard to open again without the surfactant. So surfactant help keep these alveoli open, which is super important. And last in here, they point out alveolar macrophages. Give you 3 guesses what they do. They're phagocytic cells, right? They're coming out of circulation. They're wandering around in the alveoli looking for pathogens. Sometimes you'll see them called dust cells. I think alveolar macrophage is pretty descriptive as to what they're doing. Okay, now, if we think about this, we've made it all the way down here, we've been looking at this respiratory mucosa, the epithelium and the connective tissue. When we get to the alveoli, this surface of gas exchange, let's, maybe we can go, where's a good spot? Maybe we can zoom in right here. So I have a couple different colors. So we have a capillary, right here. And then into the alveoli, I don't have purple, but I have blue, right? So here's your alveoli. Here's your capillary. Okay. We now call this the respiratory, I'm not going to have room there, the respiratory membrane. Right? Or you'll hear it called the respiratory surface. We're talking about how do we actually, right, get oxygen from the lung into the bloodstream, and how do we get rid of that waste product, CO2. These are the surfaces that those gases need to traverse. A simple squamous epithelial cell from the alveoli, a simple squamous epithelial cell, right, remember endothelium in the capillary, and a little bit of connective tissue, right, we call that the basement membrane in between there. What this does for us, this respiratory membrane is tiny. minute, right? We're trying to make very small distances so that diffusion can take place across these very small distances. Diffusion happens much faster when you do that. Okay, the other thing I wanted to point out here as we're in the lung, I love this picture, check this out. Again, this is 2311. They're showing you here the blood supply. Remember, this is the pulmonary circulation. We have deoxygenated blood coming from that right ventricle going to the lungs. Remember, that right ventricle doesn't need to push very hard. This arterial system is actually pretty low pressure, right? But we have this rich blood supply. You see all these capillaries just totally surrounding the alveoli, right? This is really important. The fact that this is under low pressure, though, has some implications. So that's one of the reasons why you might end up with a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot. Remember, when blood isn't flowing very fast, if it's sitting around, that's going to make it much easier for some of those coagulation factors to find each other and cause clots, right? If you get a pulmonary embolism, if you have a clot stuck in this circulation, then blood flow starts to back up. We're going to make the right side of the heart work really hard. You can run into things like heart failure, congestive heart failure, from blocking some of these pulmonary blood vessels.